shift one's mindset with change so that it is not something that happens to you, but it is something that you are in an ongoing conversation with. Because when it's something that happens to you, you get defensive, you resist, you push back against, you try to get back to where you were, and you see it as this exception.
Brad, what a treat to have you on. Tell me this, what inspired you to write this book?
Personal and professional. So personal is I had undergone a whole lot of change in my life in what felt like a really compressed period of time. In a five and a half year period, I had my first child, moved across the country, transitioned careers, decided to quit my job and really go at it as a full-time writer. Had an injury that took me out of a sport that had been an enormous part of my identity. Had a second child, published my first book, became estranged from certain family members. So the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between, just so much change. And then professionally, working with the clients that I do as a performance coach, wasn't just me. Everyone, it seems like, is just going through all of this intensifying rapid change. And then, of course, there's the pandemic, which is the societal change that we all experienced and worked through in our own ways. So it feels like we are in a period of the river of change is flowing very voraciously right now.
Yeah, no doubt. And you went through obviously a ton in your own life, which is cool. And I've heard you say that, right? I sort of wrote this book because I wish I had it when I was going through all this change, which is pretty cool. What's one thing you want readers to think or maybe do differently after they read it?
Can I give you two? I think there are two really important ones.
Let's do it. Yes, I'm down.
So the first is to shift one's mindset with change so that it is not something that happens to you, but it is something that you are in an ongoing conversation with. Because when it's something that happens to you, you get defensive, you resist, you push back against, you try to get back to where you were, and you see it as this exception. Whereas a much more accurate view is life is change. Things are always changing. And if we can be in conversation with change, then we don't have to enter into these periods of flux in a defensive or a scared position. We can enter into them equipped and prepared to navigate our way through, and also to realize that while change indeed shapes us, we also can shape change. So that's the first big thing. And the second is this core term throughout the book, rugged flexibility.
Yeah.
In the face of change, people tend to navigate change by going to one of these extremes on a spectrum, right? On the one hand, you can be really strong and robust and durable and rugged. And on the other hand, you can say, I'm going to be really flexible, I'm going to bend without breaking, I'm going to be soft and supple. In my research and reporting for this book, what I learned is that individuals, organizations, even entire societies that are able to skillfully navigate periods of intense change, they're not rugged or flexible, they're rugged and flexible. They don't fall for the trap of these polarities, they embrace both.
Yeah. I love the way you talk about rugged flexibility, and I want to dig into that. I want to ask you, there's a lot of research in the book. That's a big part of it. Was there anything that surprised you or was like an aha moment at some level as you were sort of digging into this topic, this issue at some level, right, that we want people to lean into more than away?
I think that the biggest aha moment is around the importance of expectations and how our mood at any given point in time is very much a function of our reality minus our expectations. And when there's a big gap between our reality and what we expected or thought it would be, we tend not to feel so well and we tend not to do so well. In one way that you can think about change is it's our expectations not being met. You know, we thought something was going to happen and something else happens. We thought things were going to stay stable and now they're not. And the faster that we can update our expectations to match reality, the better position we're in to deal with what's happening. And I think so many people, myself sometimes included, fall into this trap of not wanting to let go of what we thought was going to happen. So we're living in our heads, we're living with where our expectations were instead of in the reality. And with change, it's often a new reality.
And so, Brad, how do you do that though with not sort of leveling yourself down, right? So we don't want to expect less than, for example, whether it be with others or with ourselves. How does that work relative to managing the expectation, but sort of moving forward in
And I
our
think
lives?
I'm really glad that you asked this because this is nuance and it's important to dive into it. Having high expectations for yourself, for your relationships, for your performance, for your professional life, that is generally speaking a very good thing. So this isn't about setting the bar low for yourself and what you want to accomplish. It's about expecting that life will be hard at times and that change will be hard and that that's okay and that you can strive for excellence at the same time as you can realize that there are going to be a whole lot of big challenges along the way. You can be a very optimistic and happy person at the same time as you expect and you hold room for periods of sadness. And we don't have to lower the bar for ourselves to realize that in whatever goal we're pursuing, things are going to be hard and we should expect it. And when things change, when we don't achieve a goal or when the environment shifts, we need to see reality for what it is.
So it's interesting. You talk about how the average person goes through 36 major changes in their adult life. That's a lot, right? So why is it so hard? Because we got a lot of reps at it.
Yeah, I think it comes down to just an inappropriate mindset around change that largely traces itself to this scientific term homeostasis. Homeostasis is hundreds of years old. It's one of the first empirical science constructs. And it describes change as a process of order, disorder, order. It says that individuals like stability, and when their stability is threatened, it's an unequivocally bad thing, and they try to get back to where that stability was as fast as possible. And this has been the conventional model of change for the last 150, 200, 250 years. It was coined by someone named Walter Cannon in the mid 1800s, but it dates back to the 1500s as a way to describe what an ideal system should be. It should be stable, it should not change. Only more recently, in the last 2 decades, have scientists stepped back and said, actually, homeostasis is not really accurate. A healthy system likes stability, yes, but that stability is constantly recreating itself somewhere new. So, homeostasis, order, disorder, order. What researchers call allostasis, order, disorder, reorder. So yes, we like stability, but the way that we get stability is by recreating ourselves over and over and over again. And I find that the etymology of these words tells the whole story. So homeostasis comes from the Latin root homo, which means same, and stasis, which means standing. So it says, Molly, that we stay stable by staying the same. Allo comes from the root variable. So allostasis says that the way we achieve stability is by changing. So we can be stable through change. The way to be stable through change is by changing. Whereas homeostasis says, no, stability, you get stability by staying the same. And allostasis says, no, you get stability by learning how to skillfully dance with change. And the reason that change is so hard for us, for me, for you, for really anyone that was not born in the last 15 years is because we grew up with this mindset around change that's hundreds of years old and happens to be not very accurate nor helpful.
This is so cool and so interesting because I just submitted a book on drive to my publisher Hachette that's releasing next year, and it's all about how we get better every day through drive, right? In other words, it's not about the drive to achieve something. It's about the drive to get better every day, which is what you said, right? Which in fact requires change, right? But I've heard you talk about that it isn't sort of this finite moment in time, in fact, that makes us happy in life. What it is this constant evolution of getting better, but this rub against this historical perception of what change should or shouldn't be. So, what role does mindset play in this?
I think the mindset shift is that change is just the nature of life. Like, we need to stop viewing change as a threat or as something that is bad. Chaos, feeling unstable, is not good, but change is neutral. We get to decide if it's good or bad. We get to take action in that period of disorder. We get to shape what the new reorder will look like. So, yes, I love how you said that. We are constantly somewhere in the cycle of order, disorder, reorder. You know, it's how you get better at something, right? Like,
Right,
you
sure.
start at A, you learn skills. Sometimes you have to make tweaks. You can feel like the ground you're standing on is shaky, and then it all comes back together. You're the same person, but you're somewhere new. You've learned a new skill. It's how relationships grow. You know, you start out, you just meet someone, there's order, you go through a big challenge, good or bad. There's the death of a family member, there's a big argument, you move across the country, you have a child, you move in together for the first time. That's a disorder period. There's some chaos, the stability is disrupted, and then ideally you reorder somewhere better. The relationship is stronger. So any big change just tracks this cycle, order, disorder, reorder. And if we can expect that, yeah, there's going to be a disorder period, there will be moments where we feel a little bit disoriented, that's part of the deal, then we don't freak out in those moments.
Right, right, right. Well, and I would sort of push and say reorder better,
Yeah.
right? In other words, don't just reorder, but reorder better. In other, people talk about resilience. To me, it's not about resilience. At some level, implies this we're coming back to where we were,
Yep.
right? But we want to recover better than where we were before, above that watermark, which feels really important as we consider how we navigate change, growth as human beings.
That's right. That's why I chose this term rugged flexibility, because very early on, my publisher's like, well, is this a resilience book? And I'm like, no, no, no. Because resilience is bouncing back. Like, resilience
Right.
is kind of that old model, right? Just bounce
Right.
back, get back.
Right.
And rugged flexibility says, I'm going to walk through the stormy weather of change, and I am going to hold my ground. I'm going to stay stable through the change. And ideally, when I get through to the other side, I'm going to be a better person. I'm going to have evolved. I'm going to have grown.
Yeah. What do you think people most get wrong about change?
Ooh, so many things. I think the first is, and maybe this is where we focus because it's the most important, is again, I think people love to go to extremes. And there's two things that people get wrong about change. One is that we can control what happens during change. We can problem solve our way out of any problem. We can fix everything. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Take responsibility. You have agency. That's a misconception. An equal misconception is that we're powerless in the face of change, that every big problem is structural, that there's no point of even trying, that we just need to go with the flow, or everything is so bad, why even try to make it better? That's also BS. So we have agency, but there's limits to it. We have control, but there's limits to it. Surrendering can be helpful. Letting go of control can be helpful, but there's limits to that too. So kind of like rugged flexibility, we don't have to exist on either end of the spectrum. Like, there's very few situations that you have complete control over, and there's very few situations that you have no control in. And the job of a mature adult when navigating change is to realize there's parts of it that you don't have control of, and there's parts of it that you are, and to focus on the latter where you are in control, where you do have control, while acknowledging that there's a lot that you can't control.
Well, exactly. I mean, one of the things that I think is always important, we have three daughters, I'll say sometimes, draw a circle, and in it, put all the things that you can control about a particular circumstance. And we've probably all heard this, and then all the things you can't. And to your point, there's a lot that we can't, but there's so much that we can. There's so much that we can.
And I think the internet has been like really bad for this, because the internet just loves to reward extreme views, which is unfortunate. And I think when it comes to like especially big social changes, yeah, you just see these two camps of like toxic positivity or, you're in charge of your life, like you can do anything that you want in any circumstance. And it's like, don't go tell that to someone that was born into mass
Right.
poverty. But there's also this part of the internet that's like everything's so terrible. There's no agency in change. There's nothing that you can do except complain. And that's also bullshit. So, like,
Hmm.
again, the job of a mature adult is to recognize that we need to be in the middle. And I think both of those attitudes are cop outs. I get fired up about this
Yeah, I
because
agree.
if you are like this Pollyanna person that just buries their head in the sand and says, everything's all right in my life, so I'm not going to worry, well, then that absolves you of needing to do anything because everything's
Hmm.
fine. Even on an individual level, if you say, I'm great, there's nothing for me to improve on, everything's fine, well, that kind of absolves you of needing to take any action. But it's
Hmm.
equally true if you fall into this camp of nihilism and despair and say everything is so broken, the system's broken, why even try? That also absolves you of doing anything.
Yeah.
So these two kind of polar opposites have in common that they're cop outs.
Yep. Yep.
And I keep
Totally.
using this word mature adult because the people that I look up to the most, they realize that life is complex, it's difficult, it's hard. There's a lot that is broken, but in order to fix broken things, you can't become a broken person.
Hmm. Well said, man. Well said. Those people who are more resilient than others, and how do they view change differently in those moments? Right? I mean, in these moments where we need to recover fast, which I believe, you're a sports guy too, right? Like to me, recovering fast is huge to high performance. What do you advise people to do when they're inside of these moments where they need to tap into resiliency? They need to do it fast. How can they do it differently, like the ones who do it really well potentially do it?
I think they get really good at responding instead of reacting. So reacting
Hmm.
is instinctual, it's fast, it's emotionally very hot, it's often very rash. And when we react, we don't bring to bear our discernment, our thoughtfulness, our wisdom on a situation. It's two P's. We panic and we pummel ahead. That's what happens when we react. When we
Hmm.
respond, on the other hand, we do bring our discernment, our wisdom, our thoughtfulness, our skill to a situation. It's a lot slower. We create space between a stimulus, a change, and our response to it. So
Hmm.
that's four P's. We pause, we process what's happening, we make a plan, and only then do we proceed. And I think in these moments, whether it's on a micro scale, your dog has diarrhea in the middle of the kitchen when you're rushing your kids off to school, you get stuck in traffic, uh, you thought you were going to have a chance to speak at a big meeting, but you don't. Or if it's on a more macro scale and you don't get the promotion you want, um, there's a big shift in the economy that affects you, there's a shift in your health that affects you. I still think it really comes down to, are we going to react rashly to these things
Hmm.
or are we going to respond thoughtfully and with discernment? And I think that's what separates people that can navigate these very acute moments of disorder better than others.
Athletes talk about next play mindset, right?
Yeah,
And things happen all the time on the field or the court or the course that they can't control,
that's right.
potentially bad calls. What what do you tell an athlete who has to recover fast in those moments to do that at some level is very transferable to a boardroom when somebody doesn't like your idea and you got to keep going?
Yeah, next play mindset. I mean, it's easy to say, it's hard to do, and we'll get into maybe how to do it. But I like to like say like you got to have a short memory.
Be a goldfish.
Yeah, exactly. What happened in the past is done. I think an easy to say, hard to do thing, as I mentioned, it's like a broken record because everyone's like, yeah, next play. It's like, well, yeah, when you're in the heat of the moment, it's hard. So I think this ultimately comes down to being as present as you can for what's happening in front of you.
Hmm.
Because when you're present, you are no longer in the past. You're just in the moment. So I think that rather than trying to teach someone how to like force a certain kind of thought, it's better to teach someone that thoughts are going to come and go, and that's fine. Your job is to just be there in the moment.
Wow,
Uh,
that's awesome.
when you're in a flow state, you're an athlete,
Yep.
that's the best. Why
Yep.
is it the best? Because your thinking mind, it just kind of quiets down. It's just you and what you are doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And by definition, when you're in a flow state, you are no longer in the past. So I think like the real skill to train here is presence, right? It's like, this is what is happening right now. I'm doing the best that I can. That's a mantra I like to use. Just snap back to the present moment. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and this doesn't just have to be like on the tennis court or in the boardroom. You know, a time when I use this in my life a lot is when our first child was born. He was a terrible sleeper. Like, 45 minutes was a golden stretch. It was awful.
Oh,
And I
wow.
remember getting so frustrated in getting into that reactionary mode. And what
Mm-hmm.
I would tell myself is, this is what's happening. My kid's crying. He either needs a diaper, food, or he needs to be rocked.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing the best that I can. And then just do one of those three things. And what I realized is that my freaking out about what was happening was worse than what was happening itself. And I think that's the same thing when you have a bad call, when something goes wrong in the boardroom. It's
Mm-hmm.
often the thinking about it and the getting stuck in it that is worse than the thing. And if we can just come back to the present moment, like, this is what's happening right now, this is what's in front of me, that gives us the best chance at proceeding skillfully.
I think what's so cool, Brad, about what you're saying is that so often we hear coaches, we hear leaders, we talk about things like let it go, next play, all those things, which I think are great. But what I love about what you just said is it's really looking into that windshield, right? It's this idea of show back up and be fully present for the next moment. And it's less about the story about what happened in our mind. It's a cool little pivot relative to the
Yes.
way that you move into that next moment in a more positive way at some level, I think.
Yeah, in a way, it's getting out of your mind, you know?
Right. It's cool.
Like we're having this conversation in a podcast, and there have been times, because I'm not perfect, where I didn't frame something the way I wanted to in response to your
Mm-hmm.
question. My job is to say, all right, like, that's in the past. Boom, I'm here with Molly. I'm as present as I'm
Right.
going to be. Because when you're present, you're not in the past anymore. Because
Mm-hmm.
this sounds so cliche, but it's true. Like, all there is the moment that you have.
Right. No question. You talk about identity in the
Hmm.
book a lot, Brad. Do people underestimate how much they change as a human being, as themselves, if you will? People underestimate that.
I think so. Um, I think that identity is just this fascinating topic. It's probably the most interesting part of the book for me to have written. And it's because there's this ultimate paradox, which is, we do think of ourselves as stable. Like, my guess is you think like there is an essence that is you, that is Molly. You are,
Hmm.
when I look at you, you're there. Yet you're also always changing. You're
Right.
undergoing all of these life experiences. And even if you put someone in a bubble and shielded them from any experience, they'd still be aging, which changes you. So the question I try to ask in that section of the book is, how can we think of ourselves as strong and stable while at the same time realizing that we are always changing ourselves? And the metaphor that I like to use for this is a river. I like to think about identity like a river. So there's this famous quote from the philosopher Heraclitus. He says that we cannot step into the same river twice. And what he means by that is the river's always flowing. And I
Mm,
feel like that's true of us. Yeah, it's
sure.
also true that when you look at a river, it's there. Like, you see it, it's a concrete thing. So it's both this thing that's always changing, but it's also very stable. And what's really fascinating is that there's would be no river if it didn't have a bank, right? It'd just be like random chaotic water. So part of what makes a river is that it has this bank that channels the flow. It channels the evolution over time. And I think in our own lives, that bank, those are like our core values, the things that we really deeply hold and aspire towards. So the
Hmm.
way that we change as a person is often guided by our values, because we can always ask ourselves, what would, let's say that I value health and authenticity. I could say, well, what would the healthy thing be to do? What would the authentic thing be to do in the moment of uncertainty and change? And that helps me chart my path.
What role does our core values have in our ability to effectively change, right? To a little bit of building off of what you just talked about, which I think is an interesting component to consider.
Yeah. So let me define the term first, because I know you and I know this, but in case listeners don't, core values are these foundational principles or attributes that we aspire towards.
Hmm.
They are the things that we are living in alignment with when we're feeling our best and doing our best. So there's like 150 examples in the book, but some quick ones now. I mentioned health, kindness, wisdom, family, intellect, presence, authenticity, vulnerability. Y'all get the point. And when we have these core values and the world around us changes or something within ourselves changes, we can go to those core values and we can ask ourselves, how would I act on this in the moment? What would the vulnerable thing be to do? What would the authentic thing? What would the creative thing? Whatever the value is. And then that can help us have some stability in the midst of all this change because it helps guide our actions in that moment. And you do that over the course of your life, and then these values are basically guiding the person that you become. And that's a really powerful thing. It's back to that visualization of the river. You know, they are the bank that is channeling where your life is going to go and who you're going to become and how you will evolve as an individual.
Can your core values change over time?
Absolutely. But even then, it's your current core values that take you to your new ones.
Okay, right.
You know, so the way I like to think of it is like your core values are portable and you can take them with you wherever you go. So when there is no clear path forward, when you are in rough weather, when uncertainty is the name of the game, you've still got your core values. And in the moment, you can ask yourself, what would the practice, what would the habit, what would the action be that is in alignment with my values? And then that can guide you to what you ought to be doing.
And so going back to our values in the midst of change, I'm hearing you say, is an important component to showing up as our best self inside of change, inside of these moments.
That's right. Our values are our ruggedness. You know, it's what makes us who we really are. There's fascinating research that I profile where individuals are confronted with these like big challenging changes in their life. And then they're put in an fMRI machine so we can see their brain activity. And the control group was just told about these big challenging changes. The experimental group was told to reflect on their core values for a few minutes before. And then they were presented with the same big challenging changes. And what the researchers found is that the group that reflected on their core values showed activity in the brain associated with taking on challenges and taking action, and decreased activity in the part of the brain associated with fear and overwhelm. The group that did not reflect on their core values had the opposite. They showed so much more activity in the part of their brain associated with fear and overwhelm. And what's more is when the researchers asked the people how they felt, the people that had reflected on their core values felt confident that they could do the right thing, and the people that didn't felt completely overwhelmed. So these core values, like they really are, they're the ground that we stand on. They are our source of stability throughout change.
Man, that's cool. That's incredible data and really, wow, that's
But I mean,
interesting stuff.
when we think about it in our own life, right? Like we've all had those moments where it feels like the ground beneath us is just shaking, or whatever metaphor you want to use, the rug's pulled out from under us. But if we can come back to our core values in those moments, it still can be really scary and hard to navigate those moments. But we still have our core values to stand on. Like it is something that will always be there. We can take wherever we go.
You know, it is so cool to hear you talk about that. One of the stories that I sometimes tell when I speak is about John Smoltz, who was a client forever, and about John going from a starter to a closer to a starter. And, you know, John is a unbelievable human being who obviously happens to have been an incredible baseball player and now amazing on air. But John's about team. He's about community. He's about leadership. He's about contribution. And when the world thought he was crazy for stepping into this other role at that point in his career, to John, it was the obvious choice because it aligned with his values.
Yeah, I'm smiling, you know, ear to ear because that's such a wonderful example. He could just ask himself, like, what would someone who values team and loyalty and community do? Well, they'd step up and they do what they need to for the team and the community. And I think that's just like a profound example. Another great example of this is the tennis player Roger Federer, who is one of, if not the greatest tennis players of all time. And as much as he's known for his dominance, he's also known for his longevity. He had a very long career in tennis. Some say he kind of like recreated expectations of what's possible for a tennis player to dominate that late into their 30s. And what people often forget is around age 33, Federer's performance really suffered. He started getting injured. He had to drop out of tournaments that he once would have won in his sleep. And he had a 3 year period between age 33 and 36 where people thought he was done. They thought age finally caught up to Federer. And during that period, Federer made all kinds of changes in his game. He learned a one hand backhand that allowed him to slow down the ball. He started playing at the net more frequently to shorten points so he didn't have to run long points with these younger kids. And he even switched his racket, which is like sacrilegious for a tennis player. He let go of the racket that made him the best of all time in favor of a racket with a new technology that all the young kids were using. And at age 37, Federer won 2 major championships and was ranked number 2 in the world and had the best winning percentage of his career at age 37. And I love that story because Federer, what he valued was the sport, was tennis, was excellence, and was competition. He didn't value a specific backhand or a specific racket or a specific way of playing the game. He valued being in the arena and competing. And that allowed him to make all of these changes that other athletes would not make. They'd be stubborn. So it's another one of these examples that when change came for Federer, in this case an internal change, aging, he didn't say, well, I got to keep doing things the way I am. He said, well, what do I actually value here? What do I care about? And then how can I be flexible? How can I evolve to live in alignment with those values? So like you can see how these kind of philosophical topics become very real.
Right. What role does purpose play in this relative to our individual purpose in our lives? Often I feel like purpose rolls out from our core values, right? Our mission in life, if you will. What role does that play in this when you consider Federer, right? Like it's, I mean, his purpose wasn't to be number 1 in the world. His purpose wasn't to win tournaments. His purpose was to compete. And he loved and he appreciated the game. What role does that play in your mind?
I think it's huge. I also think it's one of the areas, and this could be splitting hairs, but it's interesting. So let's go down this road. It's one of the areas that I've changed my mind on most in the last decade is I would have used the word purpose, but now I really come back to core values. And again, this could just be a linguistic thing, but I think sometimes purpose is like so grand and big that people struggle with it. And they say, well, I don't know what my purpose is, or they experience a depression and they feel like they have no purpose and things are meaningless. Whereas core values, they're just so much more concrete. And even if you're going through a really rough time where you feel like you have no purpose, you can generally identify like these things that you value and then just show up and act on them. So I think that purpose can change over time. It often does, someone's life purpose, because it results from these values. And I think the values are really like what's underneath all of it. So whether we call it purpose or values, in the case of Federer, in the case of Smoltz, I think is integral, because if you're just latched on to the result, to being the best, being a starting pitcher, when change happens, you're going to be miserable. But
That's right.
if you can get underneath that and ask yourself, like, why do I really do this? And why did I get into this in the first place? You can be a lot more rugged.
Well, and I think the other component of that is it will end, right? The All-Star game will end. Being a starting pitcher will end. Being number 1 in the world will end. So we have to be attached to something more concrete than achievement or an outcome.
The thing that I tell the athletes that I have been lucky to work with, and it's really hard for some, the better they are, the more world-class, the harder to get their mind around, which is, yes, you're training for sport, but you're really training for life.
That's right.
And the reason I tell them that is because if they're a world-class athlete, their career is going to be over by the time they're 40, if they're very lucky.
Right.
Most likely, it'll be over by the time they're 30 to 35. And I want them to develop a mindset that has self-worth beyond just sport and helps them realize that this journey in elite sport and world-class sport is very important, but it's actually helping them become a person that is going to have a life beyond sport.
Tell me this, you talked a little bit about what Federer did between 33 and 36. Beyond the racket, beyond some of the other changes that he made, that was the window of time where he really struggled, where he really shifted physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally, potentially in a lot of ways. I don't know if he switched coaches, trainers, things, but it sounds like it was a reset in so many ways inside of that window of time. Is that, in fact, what you've
Yeah.
seen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know him personally, but from the reporting I've done, yes. Back to this model of change, right? Order, disorder, reorder. That was a period of disorder for Federer.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
order was this dominant tennis player, very stable, same equipment, same people around him, same style of play. Big change, which is aging and aging catching up to him. For whatever reason, for him, it was 33. His back gave out, and that was the first of many kind of thorny injuries related to his back. That's disorder. And then reorder was the same person with the same values, but a very different style of tennis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, burnout's a hot topic right now. And in the book, you talk about how to separate real fatigue from fake fatigue, which I think is cool. I want to dig into that. How can you tell the difference between the two?
Yeah, let me define the terms first here. So I think about real fatigue is biological, organic. Your mind body system is tired and it needs rest. And nothing is going to help you but rest. Sleeping, checking out, going offline, spending the day, the week, maybe even the month on the couch.
Mm-hmm.
Fake fatigue is when your mind body system is telling you to stay in bed or stay on the couch. But what you actually need to do is nudge yourself back into action because you are as recovered as you're going to be. And what's fascinating is that these two different sensations that feel a lot alike require two very different actions. The real fatigue requires rest, and then the fake fatigue requires what researchers call behavioral activation, which is essentially saying like you need to get going to feel good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I know that you have background in sport too. So to me, an amazing example of this in practice is when an elite athlete tapers before a big event. So for those that might not have sport experience, a taper is the period of time an elite athlete has to allow their body to rest and recover after a big block of training before they then go compete. So an Olympian might train for a 3-year cycle, 3.5-year cycle heading into the games, 4-year cycle. And then in the last couple of months, often it's actually just the last 2 to 3 weeks, they ratchet down their training to allow their body to shed the fatigue. So they have real fatigue, right? Like they need to rest. But any serious athlete knows that in the very last days of a taper, a good coach throws in some very short, high intensity efforts.
Mm.
Why do they do that? Because rest takes on an inertia, and you have to break that inertia. You don't want to get to the starting line of your race feeling groggy and flat. And what those high intensity efforts do is they wake the system up. And I think the same is true of us. Real fatigue and rest is really important, but at a certain point, we're as rested and we're as recovered as we're going to be. And what we actually need to do is nudge ourselves back into action. Mm-hmm. This happened to me personally after the Practice of Groundedness, my last book, and the start of this book. So I wrote Groundedness, I pushed it hard, I promoted it, and I was tired. I had real fatigue. I said, I need to rest. I am not starting on the next project. Mm-hmm. So I rested. I rested for a week. I rested for 2 weeks, for a month and a half. And then I still felt tired. And I said, you know what? I don't think I'm actually tired. I think I'm kind of in a rut. I think this is fake fatigue. And what I need to do is I need to force myself into action. So even though I was half asleep and I didn't feel like writing, I dragged my ass to the coffee shop. I got a coffee. I sat down. I started writing. The first day, terrible. Second day, a little bit less terrible. Third day, I entered a writing flow that I didn't break out of for 3 months, and the book was done. And if I would have kind of listened to that fatigue, I would still be on the couch. But if I would have come back too early, I would have burned myself out. So it's like this very nuanced thing of respecting the need for rest, but realizing at a certain point, rest carries an inertia that you might have to break.
What's interesting to me about this, Brad, is that how do you know, right? Like, how do you know? Because I'm a big fan of grit, right? And I think so often in life, what you see with athletes and that mindset is grind it out, grind. But at some point, that doesn't work anymore, right? Like
Yeah.
we know that. I mean, at some point, and we know that we need to recover, and we know that we need rest, and we know we need this cycle. But how can you tell
Yeah.
if it's real or if it's fake?
It's hard, and I think the only real answer I have is practice. I think that it's better to err on the side of caution and treat fatigue as if it's real and give yourself a little bit of time. But then if you're still feeling lethargic, that's when it probably makes sense to try to start snapping yourself back into action. I also think with all of these terms, we're writers. You have a book coming out. I have this book. Words matter. Words shape how we perceive the universe, right? They take these amorphous feelings and they make them very concrete. So I think these terms matter, but I think that we should view them as tools in a toolkit. So grit is great until, like you said, it gets in the way.
Right.
Resting
Okay.
is great until it gets in the way. And I think if we can have a mindset where these constructs are tools, and our job is whatever it is, as an athlete, as a parent, as a creative, as an executive, as a leader, is to have a big toolkit. And then, like any other craftsperson, we got to practice using the tools. And when we have a big toolkit and we practice using the tools, we learn what tools we need for what situations. So what excellence is about is having a big toolkit, but then learning by practicing what tools to use when. Because like any good craftsperson, we want to have a lot of tools. We want to understand them. And over time, through experience, we learn when it makes sense to grit and when it makes sense to quit, when it makes sense to rest and when it makes sense to use behavioral activation to just get going.
What are some of the questions that we can ask ourselves to weave rugged flexibility into our lives? I love in the book the 5 questions. They just feel cool, tactical. I think our listeners would love it.
All right, I will. I'm going to go through these questions because, yeah, I think they're really important. So the first is, where in your life are you pursuing rigidity where it might be beneficial to open yourself up to the possibility of change? So where are you feeling like you're just clinging to something, you're holding on, you're resisting change, where maybe if you just dropped the weight and opened up to change, it would be good, it would be freeing.
Good.
The second, we talked about expectations. In what parts of your life are you holding on to unrealistic expectations? Are you the leader of a company that still thinks that we're in a pre-COVID world and that, remote work isn't a thing that people want? And what would it look like to update your expectations? Number 3, are there elements of your identity to which you cling to too tightly? Do you define yourself by one thing? And if so, what would it look like to try to develop other sources of meaning in your life and other parts of yourself so that you can become more robust to change? Number 4, we spent a lot of time talking about this. I think it's good to reflect on, is how can you use your core values to help you navigate challenges in life? Like, what tools can you use? First, know your core values, take time, reflect, define them.
Yeah.
Think about how you can practice them, and then what can you do in the moment of challenges and change to act on your core values? The psychotherapist James Hollis says, in any moment where you feel fear, ask yourself if doing the thing, if in any moment you feel fear, ask yourself if following the fear will diminish your life or enlarge your life.
Cool.
And if the answer is diminish your life, don't listen to the fear. And then the 5th question is, in what circumstances do you tend to react where you might benefit from responding? And how can you work on that?
Those are so good, man. Brad, I love those. So tactical, so helpful. What are some of the things leaders, right? Change is constant in our work culture. What are some of the quick tips you have for leaders to do this inside of culture effectively?
I think it's about knowing your values and knowing your organization's values and knowing your team values and figuring out like how can you flexibly apply them. Your values are your ruggedness. And then the key to navigating change is to marry that ruggedness with flexibility. So know your values and then get really good at asking yourself, all right, how can I apply my values in this changing situation? And they can't just be things on a poster on the wall. I firmly believe that if an organization is going to have core values, every employee should be able to recite them and tell you what they mean, and they shouldn't all say different things.
Amen. Master of Change. It is out now. People have got to go grab it. How else can people stay connected to you, Brad?
The best way is through my podcast, which is the Growth Equation Podcast. And then my Instagram page, that's where I live most on social media. And my handle is just my name, at Brad Stulberg.
I love it. All right, I'm going to hit you with a couple quick rapid fires. All right, you ready?
Let's do it.
Favorite book?
Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Best career advice that you've ever received?
Don't worry about following your passion, follow your curiosity instead.
Oh, that's good. In the last year, what's a new habit that's improved your life?
Something I've been working on and continue to work on is marrying acceptance with problem solving. So realizing that I am a good problem solver and I can problem solve, but sometimes you just have to accept things as you are and get on with the show.
So the show's called Game Changers. So one last question. Who or what is a game changer who inspires you and why?
Ooh, this is such a good one.
It's just think about Michigan State Spartans, right? It's probably a Spartan is kind of what you know what I mean? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I'm going to say it, and you tell me if it's a bad answer. I don't want to get political, but Barack Obama, I just think that he is someone that is really thoughtful and authentic. And whatever you think of his policies, in a world where so many people lose their minds when they get to that level of stature and power, he maintained his integrity and his character. So I really look up to him.
I love it, Brad. Hey, you have been incredibly generous with your time. This was super fun. You're brilliant. Thank you so much.
Molly Fletcher, thanks for having me.